Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are going to talk about a more common than you think occurrence with orchids. And this is having them get dehydrated even though they do have roots, even though you water them properly, you see that medium stays moist for a few days, yet they still get dehydrated. And I have such an example. We're going to actually repot this orchid today and I'm going to tell you why sometimes this happens. So before we start, don't forget to give this video a like if you end up enjoying it and you find it useful, and why not subscribe? I post multiple times a week, mostly orchid content, but also other plants as well. Righty, so let's start. What I have here is a Cattleya type. And actually this happens more with Cattleyas in my experience, but it can happen with all other orchids, Phalaenopsis, Oncidiums, I would say mostly with Sympodials, but definitely it's not a rule. This is a BLC Majestic Light Glory. I have never seen this one in bloom. I got it when she was pretty young. And as you can see, I have quite a lot of wrinkles, quite a few ridges on these pseudobulbs. The leaves don't look very hydrated either. Definitely there is something wrong with this orchid, but the orchid does have some roots. It is not completely rootless, and I do make sure to not skip watering day. So the problem here, and in most cases where this apparently happens, is the fact that the orchid does not have roots where it matters, and this is inside the pot. In cultivation, we use potting mixes for two reasons. One, to give the orchid a place to stay, to anchor itself in, and second, more important I would say, is that we're trying to offer a medium which can retain some moisture and air at the same time around the roots, so that the orchid can absorb water for multiple days before drying out. This makes our life in cultivation much easier because, hey, who has time to water every day or multiple times a day? Epiphytic orchids can definitely grow with their roots in the air attached to mounds and all sorts of other objects. If you've ever had orchids climb on the wall, yeah, that can happen. Roots attached to stuff, and they can definitely grow in the air without medium. However, the amount of water in our living rooms and homes is really not all that much. Definitely, we do not have dew forming on the walls and on surfaces. It would create mold. We don't want that. But this is one way these orchids naturally would obtain water, with dew. It doesn't necessarily have to rain for them to get hydration. In our living room, since we don't have dew, they depend solely on what the medium can hold on to, what we provide, rather than what Mother Nature would provide, right? So keeping this in mind, imagine an orchid which, when you repot it, had roots, but then all of a sudden loses its roots inside the medium and you don't see them because typically they're in the middle of the pot, they didn't reach the sides yet. And this happens a lot with Cattleyas, which some of you might know have very sensitive roots. When you repot a Cattleya, some of the old roots, if not all of them, like this is the case, will just be lost. But the orchids will produce new roots. And sometimes, if these new roots do not reach the moist medium in time, the orchid gets dehydrated. Whatever little bit of water you place on the roots once a week, once every 3 days, 5 days, whatever your regimen might be for your environment, is simply not enough. Moisture needs to be around the roots for several days to maintain orchids hydrated. Orchids of this size, it's simply not enough because these guys will dry very soon and they will not catch any droplet of water for 10 days, time in which the orchid simply gets dehydrated. So I will unpot it, cut away the dead roots, and try to direct these new roots inside the medium. Maybe change the pot size as well. Now that we don't have all that many roots, we're gonna see. It's always nice to save some space. But definitely, without my help, this orchid will just continue to dehydrate. Now, before we start, I know some of you will say, why don't you just put a layer of sphagnum moss? That's temporary, that's one. I would much rather have these new roots directly going into the medium and having them branch. But second, in my environment, sphagnum moss gets full with algae within a matter of a week or two. It's just the type of environment. I cannot have sphagnum moss exposed to light because it's just gonna get full of algae, even cyanobacteria. It's gonna start to smell bad, burn the roots. It's a whole story. I don't like to add sphagnum moss as a top layer in this environment. I did that in my old environment. If that works for you, that's a solution until maybe new roots are created and they will go down. But since I'm repotting this orchid anyway, because I have the roots inside the medium, no need to put the extra top layer, which I would encourage you as well to do. If you know you had roots inside that pot when you repotted and now the orchid is dehydrated, no matter how much you water, the roots are dead. I encourage you to go back, remove the dead roots, forget about the top layers, go to the problem, fix it, and then address the top layers. Right, let's get started. All right, let's go back to the root situation a little bit. You can actually have the exact same thing happening if the orchid initially did not have roots, but it started to create new roots. It's always great to see new roots growing from a rootless orchid, but if they're not inside the medium and you don't have time to maintain them hydrated multiple times a day, maybe even, you can have the same thing happening. You can have a dehydrated orchid even though it has roots. So it's not obligatory to have some mushy roots inside the pot. And to be fully honest, I don't remember if I have roots on this orchid or not. But if my memory serves me right, I do have roots inside this pot. Why else would I use this size? One way to find out though. And as I was saying, yes, you can spray the roots at the top. You can have a top layer of moss if you really want to. But one, realistically, not many of us have the time to constantly spray the root system until one of them goes down. Maybe they won't. And second, again, some of us really don't like to use the top layer of moss, even though it's a very good solution. Yeah, there we go. I did have roots, and yeah, there we go. They are dead. Look at that. If I pull on the velamen, you can actually see the root string inside. They're all gone. Now, this is a very common occurrence with cattleyas generally. It's not going to happen with all cattleyas. There will always be exceptions, and if you have an exception, great. But if you have multiple orchids, cattleyas that is, for multiple years, you will notice a pattern. You'll notice that compared to other orchids, these guys lose their older roots much faster, especially after a repot, no matter if you didn't change the medium. So yeah, my orchid absolutely lost all of its roots. It's a good thing that we went back when I repotted this orchid. Oh no. I repotted it in October, very recently. But this also means that I can reuse this medium. It's not broken down. I might not use the bits of moss that have some algae, but definitely I can reuse the bark. It is almost fresh, but I definitely needed to remove these roots. It also doesn't smell so good. And since I'm gonna be removing these roots, I might go ahead and remove this very old growth here and pot the orchid in a tinier pot to conserve some space. So these roots are all completely gone, with the exception of one. This little stump here, let me give you a close-up. It's really cute. Do we see this little stump right here? It has a secondary root, a little branch of a root coming out of here. Yeah, this can happen. The thing is, when your root is very, very tiny, like under 1 centimeter, which would be under half an inch, it's highly doubtful that it's gonna branch. But if it's already 1 centimeter, it is highly likely that it can branch. So these stumps, even if they're so tiny and they don't look good, sometimes it's a good idea to press gently on them. If they still have substance, let them be. If they die off, it's fine. It's just a little stump. Even if it starts to break down in the potting mix, it's very, very tiny. It's not really gonna affect much. If these long roots start to break down, we have a problem. But these stumps, let them be if they're still viable, because they can actually branch. Everything else though needs to go because it's not good anymore. It is completely gone. By the way, you do have a Cattleya beginner tutorial in the description. If you've never owned Cattleyas but you want to, you're intrigued by them, check out the tutorial that I made. I do talk there more at length about Cattleyas, repotting, their sensitive roots, and how to go about properly repotting these orchids since they have this sensitivity and so on. It's okay though, this orchid will rehydrate, don't you worry. Alright, so as I was saying, I think I will cut one of the pseudobulbs. Now, here's a little bit of a nuance. One thing you should never expect from orchids is to have black or white situations. It's never just like this or just like that. There are all sorts of nuances and situations. Usually when we're dealing with a dehydrated orchid, sympodial that is, we don't want to remove older growths because they can still give energy, moisture, nutrients, and so on and so forth to the new growth. However, in my case, as you can see, I do have roots. It's just a matter of making them come in contact with the water for longer. In this case, that's one. Second, I do have quite a few pseudobulbs. And third, the last pseudobulb is yellowing. This guy will not hang on much longer. I don't want the nutrients it stored because they're already kind of depleting. What it does do though is potentially lose water, which is not something I want. This is one of those rare cases in which I personally would cut some of the structures since they're not all that useful anymore and I don't actually need them. But just so you know, in most cases, it's not a good idea to remove structures from a dehydrated orchid. If you're not sure, let the structure be. You can remove it at a later time. But this is just one of those nuances which, will come more intuitively with experience. So what I see might not be what you see. If you're not comfortable doing some of the stuff that I do, just keep on all the structures. But this is one of those important things you should know. Right, let's get a pot. I think I have one here. And I think this one is enough. My orchid already has a little wire loop around it, so I'm gonna reuse that to stake it. Another thing you can do if your orchid doesn't really fit in the pot and you wanna direct the roots carefully towards the medium is to soak them and wet them and get them very moist and hydrated first because they will become much more flexible. I'm not gonna do that because I don't need it. My orchid fits in the pot and I can direct the roots simply by tilting the orchid slightly, which is what I will do. I don't want the roots to go on a vertical inside the potting mix. I just want to slightly tilt them so that they reach that moss layer. Right. Putting some sphagnum moss at the bottom and then continuing with the bark and alternating the layers so that they all communicate and they maintain everything very even. One thing I will replenish is the slow release fertilizer. You can check the description if you want to know what I'm using. Alrighty, so we are pretty much done. Now, I know that some of you will say, but wait, those roots grew on top of the medium, so they're not really used to too much moisture. That is true. But you can adjust them. They are fresh roots, they're not old roots. In my experience, older roots really don't want to get adjusted to sudden changes. Most cases than not, they will just give up. Fresher roots, even if they grew a little bit in a different environment, they are more willing, quote unquote, to adapt, and the branches that they will grow, those will be adapted to this medium. At the same time, as I was saying, I did not place my roots vertical inside the potting mix into the lower layers. I put it at a slight angle. This particular layer of the pot is not as moist. Typically, it's a little bit more ventilated. So this will make the transition a little bit easier on the roots. And in my experience, they don't actually die off because they don't get adjusted. They're very young roots. And as long as there is ventilation, there are some air pockets in this medium, they should be good. They do not behave like old roots. Hence why these guys decided they no longer want to stay with me. They don't want to see my face anymore. But the new roots will be okay. Right, so all I have to do is water this orchid. I'm not going to go out of my way to keep it always super moist. What I want is to have just some overall humidity around the roots. Being that I don't have a lot of roots and this orchid is not super bushy, it will not drink too much water. So no need for me to actually make sure to always keep it super wet. It will also dry out slower than my other orchids. So maybe for a little while until new roots grow, I'm not gonna water it mechanically with my other orchids, which kind of have the same drying time. No, she will be treated differently for a couple of months until roots take over. And roots will take over now that we did this. Righty. So I will keep you up to date in one of my monthly highlights. I'm gonna show you the changes with this orchid because the changes will be really cool to see. Right, let me show you a few more examples that have to do with today's subject, just so you'll build experience like through me in a way. So I have a cattleya here. This is the Walkeriana cerulean. This one, as you can see, Again, it is showing some signs of stress. It is a new orchid, I just repotted it, and it did the very same thing. Since it didn't have a lot of roots in the medium, it got dehydrated even though it started to produce brand new roots at the top. And you can see I have quite a few roots at the top, but in this case, there is absolutely no need to intervene because I can also see roots that went inside the medium. So much so that they are coming out of the ventilation holes, which is absolutely normal. Orchids can do that. So it's just a matter of time for this orchid. There is no need to disturb it. And I do remember that it really didn't have a whole lot of roots that I need to cut away since I repotted this pretty recently. So same situation, different course of action depending on what the orchid does. Same story here. This one I did exactly what I did with the Cattleya of today because it was getting very dehydrated, and this orchid now looks very good. The roots started to grow. I have a brand new growth here, and yeah, the orchid is not all that dehydrated anymore. So in this instance, things worked out great. Same situation with this one, exactly the same situation. The roots inside didn't make the repot, but I have a whole lot of brand new roots, and I know for a fact this has worked out because the orchid is not as dehydrated as it used to be. If you can see on this main growth, I do have signs of previous wrinkles, but the wrinkles are not there anymore. So I don't need to see the roots on the sides of the pot to know that there are roots absorbing water inside this pot. If the orchid is getting hydrated, obviously there are roots. Now, when it comes to Phalaenopsis, in my experience, things are not the same as with Cattleyas. Phalaenopsis tend to have much more robust roots. They grow much faster. They can be produced pretty much throughout the year. Whereas with Cattleyas, depending on the species, you might have a particular season of root production. It's not going to happen all the time, and that makes things a little bit more complicated. But sometimes even Phalaenopsis can make you a little nervous. I have here two of my most recent Phalaenopsis, got them last month. I repotted them already. There is a difference between these two, although they have been repotted at the same time last month. One of them looks a little bit more dehydrated, while the other does not look dehydrated, and it also already has brand new root tips forming. It doesn't mean you have to go back for this orchid and see if there's anything there in the medium. I look at the surface, I don't see anything becoming mushy. I look inside the pot, I do have a little bit of a root here. It's green, it's nice. Even though the orchid is very slightly dehydrated, sometimes it has to do with the fact that you leave on the flowers, which is something that if your orchid is suffering, you should get rid of. I trust my orchid that she will be okay. It does have a good root system, but you can see it looks a little bit more dehydrated than this one. It's because of the flowers. It's because of the difference in these two individuals. This one is just more vigorous than this one. But don't jump to conclusions. Take into account all of the details you see. Do these orchids have flowers? Yes, flowers consume energy. Alrighty, do we have enough roots to sustain the flowers? Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe barely, like in this case. I will go ahead and cut them, and that is that. I just wanted to enjoy them a little bit. But that's why I have mild dehydration signs. It does not mean the roots are gone. Whereas this one is as hydrated as it can be, very stiff leaves, very nice orchid, and new roots are already growing. It's just because these two orchids are very different between them, even though they have been repotted in the same way at the same time. So keep that into account and read the room, I guess, as it were. Read your orchid. Look at all of the signs, and you will be surprised how many things your orchids will tell you as well. So mild dehydration signs might actually be normal depending on if you have flowers on your orchid, if you just repotted your orchid, what type of orchid is it. Phalaenopsis are robust, but they as well can get overwhelmed by flowers and get a little dehydrated. If the situation does not improve, like in a week or two, cut the flowers. It's okay, you're gonna see them next flowering season. But sometimes you don't need to cut the flowers after you repot an orchid or before you repot an orchid. Just read your orchid, see what it tells you. Because not all orchids demand the same things, so just don't jump to conclusions. So, I hope this helps you out. Hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you'd like to follow me on social media, just search for me. I am at MissOrchidGirl, but most importantly, subscribe to this channel because I post multiple times a week orchid and plant content. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!